Good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, thanks for joining us here today, and thanks for Engineering New Zealand for hosting this event. I'm Alan Brent. I'm with the Sustainable Energy Systems Group at Vic Uni, but today I'm here representing the Sustainability Society. For those of you that know the Society, we're officially a technical working group of Engineering New Zealand, but our membership span a whole range of different disciplines with many environmental managers and scientists, etc. So if you haven't done so already, the first Wednesday of every month we have a green drinks in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch. So please do come along, rub some shoulders with like-minded people. The Society also hosts similar webinars to this, and as an example, this coming Friday, the 25th at 12 o'clock, we have a quite exciting webinar with a panel career to explore Te Mana o Te Wai and how this is going to shape our future work for rural and urban Aotearoa. And the specific focus of Friday will be water, so and water systems, and how do we plan and design the systems more effectively. And this is really with the whole discussion around the reform of the RMA. This is an exciting space to watch. So please join us if you can on Friday. You can find the Sustainability Society obviously on the web, the sustainabilitysociety.org.nz, or just go to Facebook or LinkedIn, and the event is linked there. But for today, we're going to be talking more carbon. And as we all know, with the COVID situation last year, we saw quite a dramatic change or decrease really in energy consumption, and there was a lot of discussion globally around what this is meant for carbon emissions. But today we're joined here by Jocelyn Turnbull. She's a senior scientist in the Radiocarbon Lab at GNS Science, and she's also affiliated with the University of Colorado in the US. And yeah, they've been doing quite a bit of work on looking at carbon emissions and associated with our transportation sector. So Jocelyn, thanks for joining us, and yeah, we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thanks Holly for setting all of this up, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to talk about this particular study that we did looking at changes mainly in traffic-related emissions in New Zealand during lockdown. We do a lot of work on looking at greenhouse gas emissions in general and changes in those emissions. So this is just one of our projects, and it's kind of a fun one to see, because it really, we got involved a lot of people, a lot of citizen science, and the pictures that you see there are some of the children who participated in the citizen science project, and they're all collecting grass samples for us. Obviously, of any of these kind of research projects, there's lots of people involved and lots of contributions. And in addition to the scientists involved, we were funded, the Ministry for the Environment supported us, as well as GNS Science's SIF, which is our core funding from the government. All right, so I'll get into it. I'm going to talk about these changes in COVID-related emissions and emission changes in COVID, related to COVID in New Zealand, but I'll start off with sort of an introduction about the carbon cycle generally and about greenhouse gas emissions, and then I'll talk specifically about how we use radiocarbon to trace the fossil fuel CO2 component and how we can use that in these grass samples, and then I'll get into the actual data from this study. So these graphs might be familiar to some of you. The one on the left is what's known as the Keeling curve. This is the measured increase in CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere since they started measurements in 1958. And those measurements are from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And of course, you see this increase in CO2 that's driven by fossil fuel CO2 combustion and emissions. The graph on the right is maybe a little bit less familiar. That's a very similar record. It's made at Bering Head, just near Wellington. And that is the longest record of CO2 in the atmosphere from the Southern Hemisphere. And it was set up by folks at what was DSAR and then subsequently became GNS and NIWA. And it was set up in collaboration with the folks from Scripps. And you can see there as well, we see this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. It's happening everywhere. So clearly we want to understand these increases in CO2 and see what we can do about them. So looking at what happens in New Zealand, we can think about what we know about our greenhouse gas emissions. And for many people, you may be aware that methane is really important in New Zealand, and that's around about half of our emissions. And you see that here in the top graph that shows agriculture is around about half of the CO2, and most of that is methane, not CO2. And that's biogenic methane from farming, largely dairy farming, but also other kinds of farming. New Zealand's really unique in that regard, that agriculture is such an important component of our emissions. For most places around the world, it's CO2 from fossil fuel burning that is the big source. And importantly, in New Zealand, that CO2 from fossil fuel burning is still about half of our emissions. And it's maybe easier for us to attack to try to reduce emissions. And if you look at the graph on the bottom there, that shows our emissions from fossil fuel combustion categories in 1990 in the dark blue and then 2015 in the light blue. And what you see very clearly is that transport, which is the third one along, is not only the largest source of fossil CO2, but it's also growing dramatically. So that's really a place where if we understand those emissions, maybe we can do something about them. And we probably should do something about them if we want to meet our obligations. And we do have obligations. So New Zealand, like every country in the world, including the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement as of this year. So every country in the world is committed to reducing their emissions. And in addition to those kind of international agreements, we have our own things. In New Zealand, we have the Zero Carbon Act, which is subtly different than the Paris Agreement. And then we also have even finer scale things like most cities, many cities, especially the big ones, have developed their own goals to mitigate emissions. And so if we want to be able to do that, we need to be able to understand what our emissions are. Can we detect the changes in them? And, you know, are we achieving the things that we want to achieve? And particularly at the fine scale, say for city governments, they're the ones who might have policies that they want to enact to reduce emissions. And so they really need to be able to see if those are effective at that kind of fine scale of the city level, not just at the level of what are the sum total of our emissions for our country. So that's kind of the context of what we're thinking about. During COVID, we know that emissions went down because people stopped driving, there was a lot of industry shut down, but it's actually really challenging to measure this. So I showed you just before the Keeling curve of CO2 going up on the left there. And what you see on that is the long-term increase, which is shown as the black annual mean line there. And then you see that noise in the red as well. And that noise is what we call the planet breathing. That's photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis is plants taking carbon dioxide out of the air and using it to grow. And then respiration is animals and also plants taking oxygen from the air and respiring CO2 back to the atmosphere. And that causes this big seasonal cycle in CO2. And that seasonal cycle is variable from year to year, depending literally on the weather. And so on the right, what is shown is the detrended seasonal cycle from the graph on the left. So that's subtracting the long-term trend and just looking at the seasonality for the last 10 years. So in blue is the years from 2010 to 2019. And then the grey band is the variability in that seasonal cycle over those 10 years. And then the red is the CO2 seasonal cycle in 2020 when COVID happened. Now you can see in March that it's a little bit lower than it was in other years, but it's not outside the band of variability that we see from natural variability. So even though it was quite a big drop in emissions, when it's a very short-term change like it was with COVID, it's really hard to detect that at the global scale. And so that's been a real challenge to think about how can we actually see these changes in emissions. So this is where radiocarbon dating comes in. So some of you will be familiar with radiocarbon dating as a way to find out how old things are. And we're using it in a slightly different way, but using the same technique. So radiocarbon is the radioactive isotope of carbon. It's very rare. It's produced naturally in the upper atmosphere. And then it reacts to form CO2, and then it exchanges through photosynthesis being taken up into plants, get through respiration going back out into the atmosphere, and similar processes of exchange in the ocean as well. Radiocarbon is radioactive, it decays with a half-life of a bit over 5,000 years. But things that are in contact with the atmosphere, so any animal or plant that's alive and is exchanging constantly with the atmosphere, will have roughly the same amount of radiocarbon as the atmosphere, because even though it's decaying, it's being replenished by that natural production in the atmosphere. But anything that gets out of contact with the atmosphere, it starts to lose radiocarbon through radioactive decay. Fossil fuels are millions of years old, so they have no radiocarbon left. So now we have this way of tracing CO2 that's coming from burning of fossil fuels has no radiocarbon in it, and when it gets added to the atmosphere, it reduces the relative amount of radiocarbon in the local atmosphere. We can measure that, and we can actually quantify how much of the CO2 that we're looking at came from fossil fuels versus how much came from those biogenic things, from the photosynthesis and respiration and other exchange processes. And so we get away from this problem of this big seasonal cycle in CO2. Now, with looking at radiocarbon, we can just isolate the component from fossil fuels. So just to give you a bit of a sense of how this might look, this is a model simulation to show you how radiocarbon works. So on the left, this is a model simulation of fossil fuel CO2 emissions. It's denoted as CO2FF here. And what we've done is we've emitted them from where we think all the emissions are, and then they've been transported in the atmosphere by the winds. And so you see hotspots of emissions in all the big populated areas of the world. You can see the east coast of the US, you can see Europe, you can see East Asia, and the little dot to, sort of under Scandinavia, that's Moscow. And so you can see that, and you see sort of these plumes that move towards the east, the downwind of the emission areas as those emissions get pushed away by the atmosphere. And then if you look on the right, this is the same model, but now simulating radiocarbon in CO2. And in addition to the fossil fuel CO2 having no radiocarbon, we've also simulated all the other things that we know can have small effects on radiocarbon in the atmosphere. But what you see really clearly from this is that these graphs look really similar. The radiocarbon one, by the way, the colour scale is inverted, so the red colours are lowest radiocarbon values where the relative radiocarbon content is less from the addition of fossil fuels. So you can see there's a really good matchup. We can use radiocarbon as a tracer for fossil fuel CO2. If you really want to get into the weeds, at the bottom there is the equation of how we actually use radiocarbon to calculate fossil CO2. I'm not going to go into the equation though. All right, so getting into this great greenhouse gas grass-off project. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that was what our comms people came up with, so we're sticking with it. I actually rather prefer the headline that Stuff came up with. Bored kids collecting grass clippings during lockdown help reveal dramatic cuts to carbon emissions. So the challenge for us was that, as you all know, during COVID lockdown, we were not able to go anywhere, and we had tried to be able to get permission to go out and collect samples because we immediately recognised this, the first ever opportunity that we've had as environmental scientists to actually see a drop in emissions. So the last time there was a significant drop in emissions was in the oil crisis in the 70s, and that was before people were making serious atmospheric measurements of greenhouse gases. So we've never had an opportunity to see a big change in emissions, and we don't get to do experiments as environmental scientists. So this is the first natural, if you will, experiment to actually see if we want to detect changes in emissions. We think we know how to do it, but can we? Does it actually work? So we really wanted to try this. But we couldn't go anywhere. We weren't able to get permission to travel. So we came up with this idea of getting a citizen science campaign. And what we did is we asked people to collect grass samples. So as I already said, when plants photosynthesize, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they use it to grow. And the carbon from that CO2 ends up in their leaves and their wood. And it faithfully records the radiocarbon content of the CO2 that they absorbed. So plants are natural samplers for radiocarbon and CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we know the growth period of the particular part of the plant that we sample, then we know when they've sampled the atmosphere. And grass is really an ideal thing to use because it grows relatively quickly, and then you can cut it right down to the base and then it grows again. And so then you know that the next sample that you take is recent growth. So what we did is we asked people to collect grass samples from their front lawn or in a neighbourhood park, somewhere that they were safely and legally allowed to go to during lockdown, and collect samples for us. And we asked them to collect from the same spot every week from level 4 right back through all the phases of lockdown and through into level 1, so that we could look at the changes in emissions. And like I said, we got lots of people involved, lots of children. We ended up with 441 people signed up, and you can see in the graph on the right, the map on the right, you can see from pretty much all over the country. These kind of citizen science campaigns, lots of people sign up. Not everybody ends up doing what they hope to do, but we ended up getting about 110 sets of samples sent back to us at the end of the time, and many of them were from children. It was a lot of families did this, and they sent us photos, they wrote us letters, they drew us maps. Some even did little Excel spreadsheets. So it was a really good science learning thing for a lot of children, and I think a lot of parents really enjoyed it as an opportunity to get their kids thinking about something, getting them off screens during lockdown. So then we had to take of those 110 sets of samples, which was more than 1,000 bags of grass when we got them, we had to figure out what we could measure. So first of all, not everybody had managed to sample right through the lockdown period. So we only selected from those that actually had samples from level 4 right through to level 1. And then we had to do a lot of screening. Some of them really, unfortunately, when they mailed the samples back in the first little while after lockdown finished, mail was really slow, and some of them went moldy in the mail. And so those obviously we couldn't use. And there were some others where people hadn't followed the instructions or things like that. But still, we got quite a lot of very good samples. And then we also screened for looking for locations where we thought we'd actually see a signal that there would be fossil fuel emissions in that area. And we also chose a few sites where we thought there would not be a signal, so that we'd have a clean air signal to compare with. So we ended up with 26 sites that we chose. To show you what we do to make a measurement of radiocarbon in grass, we started off, we need to look under a microscope, pick out nice looking blades of grass, and we'd take a whole blade of grass so that we knew that that was representing the growth period from the time that the grass was last cut, which was the prior week of sampling, until when it was picked. And then we have to do a chemical cleaning with acid to remove any contamination on the surface. Then we burn that grass actually in an evacuated tube to convert it to CO2 gas. We take that CO2 gas, we reduce it to graphite with hydrogen, and then we measure the radiocarbon content using a technique called accelerator mass spectrometry, where we actually count the atoms of all the different isotopes of carbon. From that, we determine the radiocarbon content of the sample, and from that, we calculate fossil fuel CO2. So quite a long-winded process, but this is what we do for a living. This is what our lab does, so it goes really well. And actually these grass samples are some of the easiest ones that we've ever measured. The only downside of them is that when we were drying them, the whole lab smelt like grass for quite some time. All right, so into the results. We'll start with Wellington. So this is 2 sites on Cambridge Terrace in Wellington. For those who are not familiar, Cambridge Terrace is a pretty busy urban street in central Wellington, and it's got this median down the middle you can see in the Google map there. And so these sampling sites were in the median of Cambridge Terrace. So the top one, which we call number 1, is the top one also on the map, and it's right next to an intersection. And then the lower graph is a site that was sort of in the middle of a section of road, not so close to an intersection. And what you clearly see in both of these is that from level 4 on the left through to level 1, there is an increase in fossil fuel CO2. The absolute magnitude is different at the different sites. It depends on how far away the site is from the road and what's happening with the air. But nonetheless, you see this very dramatic increase in emissions, and it's about a 75% increase at both of these sites. You can also see, quite interestingly here, is that the top site, which is the one next to the intersection, you see that when we go into level 2, there's quite a jump in emissions, whereas at the bottom site, it's sort of more of a gradual increase in emissions through level 2. And what we think is happening is that we're actually really seeing the difference between an intersection where you start to get traffic build up almost constantly, relatively quickly. So you get a jump in emissions once you reach some threshold of having enough traffic to be kind of constantly there, versus the second site, which is in the middle of a street, which will have less constant traffic in it. So we think we're actually seeing that difference in what's happening in local emissions, just even 100 metres apart on the road. Here's some more sites in Wellington. These are all sort of associated with motorways. The top one is at the off-ramp at Willis Street at the end of State Highway 1 in Wellington, and there's also an air quality station there. The next one is on State Highway 1 just by Paikakariki up on the Kapiti coast, and the bottom one is State Highway 2 in Upper Hutt. And you see in all of these this very clear change in emissions from level 4 right through to level 1, and again around 75% change. Not all our sites are that easy. So here's some examples of things that are a little bit different. So the top one is actually a site that we've deliberately chosen as a clean air site. This one is just outside of Whangarei. And the idea was that we wanted to have some sites where we thought we'd see no emissions and see what we got. And you can see here that indeed there's a little bit of variability. It looks like there could be a little fossil CO2, but that's actually within the noise of the uncertainty of the measurements. And so this was sites like this, we had this one and several others, are a way for us to diagnose if we're doing things right. And I didn't go into the details of calculating fossil fuel CO2, but there are some corrections that we need to make to get that right. And so we're able to use these clean air sites to test if we're doing those corrections right and getting the right answers. So those sites don't have a signal of changes in emissions, but they're still very useful. The second one in the middle is a site in Wellington, again, that was further from any sources, probably 100 or 200 metres from sources. And you see that there is an increase in emissions from level 4 through to level 1, but that scale is pretty small and the error bars are really large compared to the size of the signal. So even though it looks like there's a signal there, it's kind of hard to use data from a site like that, but just because the uncertainties are so large. And then the bottom figure is an example of a site that really is pretty hard to interpret. And this is an example of the importance of understanding meteorology, understanding what the winds are doing. So what we're measuring in these samples is a concentration of fossil CO2 at the location where the grass grew. But that concentration is the product of the emission rate and how those emissions were transported to the site. So if there's a lot of variability in winds coming from different directions at different times, and particularly if the sources of emissions are, say, in one or two specific directions, then depending on the wind direction, the emission, the concentration that you observe will be really different at the site on different days, depending on the wind. So this site is one where the wind's clearly dominating the signal. Whereas at most of our other sites, if I just step back, you can see that during level 1, when we think that emissions should have been pretty constant, you see that those are pretty stable. So we think that the meteorology is not a big driver at most of these sites. But there were a few where the meteorology was a big problem, and so those sites we had to exclude. But nonetheless, we got lots of data from lots of places. Here's some examples from Auckland. The bottom one is in Grafton, which is fairly close to the central city, and it looks very similar to what we saw in Wellington, around about a 75% increase. The top one is right in the Auckland CBD on Anzac Ave, for those who are familiar. And you see that there was a change in emissions. It was lower in level 4, but not as much lower as in other places. And we suspect, and I'll show you in a minute some other data to support it, we suspect that it's because heavy traffic, and particularly buses, continued in central Auckland, and those are actually a pretty dominant source of emissions there. So we're really seeing this difference in how did emissions change in different places through lockdown. Here's some examples from a couple of busy streets in Christchurch, the top two, and then one on a rural road in Canterbury. Again, we're seeing this clear change in emissions, and some sites in Hamilton and Gisborne. These are city sites. So again, we're really seeing very much the same story, mostly wherever we look. Sort of summarising it, we had 17 sites that we were able to actually determine a change in emissions at level 4 relative to level 1. So that's what's shown here. It's the reduction in level 4 relative to level 1 for each of these sites. And you see again, as I mentioned, that site on Anzac Ave, which is the one on the far left of this graph in Auckland, had a lot lower decrease in emissions than everywhere else. On average, it was about 75% decrease in emissions across all of these sites. That particular site, it was more like 35% decrease in emissions, which we suspect is maybe related to this heavy traffic and buses. So just to see if does this make sense in the context of other things, we looked at some other metrics. So one that you may have seen. There's been quite a lot of people have talked about this Apple mobility data, and there's this, Google has a similar product, Google mobility data, and then TomTom navigation also has one. I just chose the Apple mobility data. They don't really tell you what this data is. It's a little bit opaque of how they collect it, but our understanding is that it's mostly based on requests for directions. So looking at the change in the number of requests for directions. And they started with January 1st, 2020 as 100%, and then everything's relative to that, which again for New Zealand, we know that January 1st is probably not a typical day. And in fact, you can see here that in February, the numbers went up in the Apple mobility data relative to January 1st. But nonetheless, and they provided this data I've done, shown on the colours for different parts of New Zealand. On average, it's about an 83% drop in driving requests or in Apple mobility data in level 4 relative to level 1. You do see some subtle differences in this, particularly you see it in Gisborne. There's less of a drop, and we suspect that that's related to the fact that these are for whole regions, and Gisborne is a lot more rural overall than the other regions that are shown here. So perhaps less of a drop in emissions there, where there's more rural travel, perhaps decrease less. But nonetheless, this is pretty consistent with what we see from our observations. A second thing is looking at traffic counts. So this is from Waka Kotahi. 2 sites in Auckland and 1 in Wellington, 1 in Christchurch, 1 in Hamilton. We did not have data for Gisborne, but I've shown Dunedin there as well. Just it's another example. The graph on the left just shows those changes in emissions at all the sites. Obviously, one of them in Auckland has a lot more traffic counts than anywhere else, but the relative change in emissions that are shown on the right are consistent across the sites, about a 75% drop across all sites. And the graphs there, the top is light traffic. So it's total traffic, I should say, heavy plus light, and the bottom one is just heavy traffic. And what you see, the decrease in heavy traffic was more modest than the decrease in light traffic. So again, we think that's why our results in central Auckland, where there's a more dominance of heavy traffic, why that showed a lower change than in other places. And just showing that again, our data from our grass sampling observations is really consistent with those that traffic information that we saw. So we're seeing the 75% drop in emissions. It's pretty robust, but there's also variability from site to site that really can give some insight into how things are happening in different places, and that would allow in the future to really be able to observe changes in specific locations. Just to wrap up, I'll just tell you about that project, the grass sampling project through COVID is obviously a sort of a unique project that we've wrapped up now. But we're doing a lot of other work to understand New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, and Carbon Watch New Zealand is a project across all of New Zealand to understand our CO2 and methane budgets. And this part of it is focused on Auckland as our largest city. So we've been making flasks measurements, collecting flasks of air from 26 sites around Auckland for the last 4 years. And just in the last 6 months, we've installed at the sites shown with the red stars, permanent measurement stations where we're measuring CO2, methane, and also carbon monoxide continuously every 2 seconds, and collecting weekly flask samples, so that we can really get at understanding Auckland's emissions and how they're changing through time, and understanding the different source sectors that are contributing to those emissions. All right, and I'll leave it there just with the conclusions that we're able to use radiocarbon quite easily to see fossil fuel CO2 added into the atmosphere. We can see a big decrease in emissions during level 4 lockdown in New Zealand across a bunch of different places. There's some variability depending on location that we think is real. And now we're working further on looking at emissions at a larger scale. And I've just shown here some of the other places that we are working on research projects to look at urban emissions. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Jocelyn. There's a few questions that came in, and I think this last slide possibly answers the one question, which was, whether similar studies have been carried out internationally.
So in terms of COVID, there has only been a small amount of work on CO2 changes. Our study is the only one we're aware of at this point that's actually been able to isolate the fossil fuel CO2. There's I think 4 studies internationally that I'm aware of that have been published that have looked at total CO2. There's quite a lot of work has been done looking at changes in air pollutants, things like particulates and NOx, which are a little easier to measure, and the changes are more readily seen because most of those air pollutants, they don't have a background like CO2 does, so they're easier to measure. So this particular study is quite unique, but in the context of others, yeah.
Okay. And then there's a question here around sampling sites and airports. Because obviously we're focusing here on road transportation, but I guess the question is around how aviation changed and whether there's some results that point to that.
So atmospheric measurements, as we do of aviation, are pretty challenging because the planes go away, right? They take off and they go away. And they're also challenging just in terms of how they are tracked. So, air travel is pretty well documented. So emission inventories, which are basically bottom-up accounting of where emissions come from, are pretty good for aircraft. But the rules around air travel and how they're reported are a little different. Only domestic aviation emissions are included in reporting for any country, and international aviation is not currently included, although obviously it's significant. But also, to put it in perspective, for New Zealand, traffic is about, I should say globally, traffic is about 30% of CO2 emissions and air traffic is about 3%. So yeah, driving makes more difference, but yeah.
There was a question here around how complete do you think the coverage is for this study?
Well, of course it's not complete. So I actually didn't say, when you're sampling grass, it's growing at the surface of the earth, right? Obviously. And so that means that the area that what we say it sees, the footprint of what it's sampling is very nearby. So we think that emissions within about 20 meters dominate. So it's really a very local measurement. So clearly these are not complete coverage. And so for this particular study, that was great. We had to be pretty innovative to resolve the problem that we couldn't go collect samples. But as I showed in if I go back to the last slide, if that works. What we're doing in Auckland now, and there's a few cities around the world who are doing this, we put in sampling sites that are at all of the sites with the stars are on rooftops or on high points, like in Auckland on some of the little volcanoes, so that they're high up. In a lot of cities, people use cell phone towers, for example, and those have a much larger footprint. So then you can cover most of your city from a modest number of sites. So that's the kind of thing we're going for to exactly resolve that issue.
Okay. There was a question earlier on, but I think in my mind you did address it, but it was just whether these results are affected by airborne contaminants. But I think that was with the test sites that you had, right?
Yeah, no, this is one of the things that's really wonderful about using radiocarbon, because it's actually in the CO2 itself. It doesn't get confused by other things. There's other ways that people have tried to separate fossil CO2 from the natural CO2 variability, and they work in some circumstances, but they're usually what we call correlate traces. So it's some other gas that's co-emitted or emissions are co-located, and then you've got to make some sort of relationship to be able to make that work. And those can have problems with contamination. Radiocarbon, not so much. We do have to worry with radiocarbon. There's three things, but two that typically matter for radiocarbon. One is that not a problem in New Zealand, but nuclear power plants produce radiocarbon along with other radioactive isotopes. So if you are somewhere near a nuclear power plant that is producing radiocarbon, and it's specific types of power plant that produce it, then you can have a problem. And the UK is probably the biggest example of that the particular nuclear reactors they use there cause contamination. And the other problem is a little bit more subtle, and that's that when respiration of CO2 back into the atmosphere comes back out, it has a slightly different radiocarbon content in the atmosphere, only slightly different, but that's what we have to correct for, and that's what we use those clean air background sites for, to make that correction.
Yep. Okay. It's an interesting question that came in here, just some observation on the test site in Wellington, and the comment is that what happened during level 3 on Kent Terrace, the traffic lights were more in sync, and once we went into lower levels, and that synchronization of traffic light phases, because of the concentration of the traffic, and sort of, so the last bit of this kind of comment is maybe a question that I had. What do we do with this? Because what the person suggests is that if we have more low-speed areas with better synchronization of traffic lights, then we're going to have less emissions, because vehicles are just. It sometimes irks me how many times we need to stop and just idle away internal combustion engines. So, maybe if you want to respond to that.
It sounds to me like you and the person who asked the question know a whole lot more about traffic light synchronization than I do. So you probably have a better idea. But I think that's it. It looks like that's what we're seeing, that we can actually see these. We can pick up these differences in emissions that can tell us something about how we might want to manage traffic. And the answers may not necessarily be obvious. I'm thinking of when people have hybrids that can switch off the engine when they stop, maybe that's not such a bad thing to have people stop rather than just creeping along. I don't know what the answer is. You might know better than I do, but getting this kind of level of information where you can see these differences and you can actually visualize what's happening, I think is really helpful to start thinking through these problems. One of the real challenges, I think, with climate change is that we don't see greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so this gives us a way to actually see what we're doing and to recognize that we're changing things.
Okay. There's a question that just came in terms of how this kind of scientific approach complements, maybe, or how does it compare to with other ways of monitoring fossil fuel emissions?
Yeah, so what we call the traditional way of determining emissions is through inventory reporting. So New Zealand, along with all of the other developed countries, and now the developing countries, report emissions to the Paris Agreement and all of that. And so those are based on basically on economic information, how much fuel was bought and sold, what are the outputs of power plants, so on and so forth. And those methods have served us very well at getting good numbers. And for some areas, they're really good. If you want to know traffic for all of New Zealand, well, all that fuel gets imported into New Zealand. So you know how much fuel's come in, you know the carbon content of the fuel, that's great. But if we want to get down to this finer detail of where are the emissions happening, then that national inventory doesn't really help us. And there are some gases that are trickier. So for example, the what are called the F gases. So these are the CFC replacements that have been brought in to solve the ozone hole problem. Some of those are greenhouse gases and very strong greenhouse gases. So emissions of those are basically leaks from the kind of air conditioning and cooling systems that they're used as coolants in. And to figure out what the emissions of those are, you have to use what's called an emission factor. You say, how many fridges do we have and what is the average leak rate? Well, those emission factors are very poorly known. So we just don't know emissions of those gases. And there's several other examples of things that we don't know very well. Another one is CO2 from this biogenic exchange and from wood burning. We really don't know very well from these inventory-based methods. So these atmospheric observations can really help us in those areas where the information we currently have is not as good as we need, or where the information that we currently have is really aimed at a different application. So trying to get down to the smaller scale of cities want to implement changes and national inventory doesn't help them. So those kind of things. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how to put these things together so that these observations can actually be used to develop policy and to make changes.
There is a question here around how does the trend observed through the levels of lockdown compare or overlap with the natural breathing that you discussed?
Right. So again, because we're using radiocarbon as our measurement to calculate the fossil fuel CO2, that natural breathing goes away because that doesn't affect the radiocarbon. If we measure CO2 itself, the concentration of CO2, then it does matter. And that's been a challenge, particularly if you look here at the time period in New Zealand. We go from the end of summer in level 4 into the middle of winter in level 1. And so that if we looked at total CO2, we see changes in CO2 concentration that are associated with that seasonal cycle, with more photosynthesis, removing CO2 in the summer and less in the winter. But when we measure radiocarbon, we only isolate the fossil fuel CO2 component. So that problem goes away, and that's why we do it.
Raja, I had a very technical question here. So what kind of acid are you using to clean grass?
It's just hydrochloric acid. It's at 0.1 normal.
And then, like I said, a last question that just came in here. I mean, do we know if the estimates will be greater or lesser than the inventory approach?
So we do have some inventory data for New Zealand. So again, the challenge is that because lockdown was fairly short-lived, the national inventory report that's compiled by MFE, which is what we report for the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, that's an annual total, and it's about 2 years behind. So we don't have 2020 numbers for that yet. So we don't know what that is, but it will come. But there's a more recent initiative from Stats New Zealand where they've been trying to actually get more detail. So they're producing regional emission estimates for each region of New Zealand. So breaking down those national emissions estimates. And they've done it on a quarterly scale. So they have done that for 2020. And so we do see a drop in emissions in the second quarter of 2020. They're on a quarterly scale. So again, you don't get the fine detail that we see here. So I actually tried to compare what they have with what we have, and it's just tricky because the timescales don't match up. So I couldn't do a direct comparison. But certainly we're in the same ballpark.
Yeah, and I guess it's going to be interesting if we. The hot debate at the moment, obviously, is government's push for the EVs and so on, and so it will be interesting over time to see how that affects these trends. And I think an important aspect that your study highlights are the results in Auckland. So if we don't do something about our public transport system in the sister cities, we're still going to see those emissions.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly, I mean, you can think of this, if we converted our fleet to EVs tomorrow, we would have emissions that look like level 4 from our traffic. So that it really gives us the idea that we can make a difference. And for most of us, most individuals in New Zealand, our emissions are dominated by driving. And so it is something that each of us, if that's what we want to do, we can make a change, use alternative transportation and work from home 1 day a week would be a 20% drop in our personal emissions. So, it's doable.
Yep, absolutely. All right, there's no more questions that came in. Jocelyn, just thank you very much again for your time and sharing the results. Really very interesting stuff. Because we need to understand more locally what's happening to our carbon emissions. And again, Holly and Engineering New Zealand, thanks again for hosting this webinar. Great. Thank you, everybody.